In this video, we'll explore all 14 required Supreme Court cases for the AP Government and Politics exam. In the next hour, you'll gather the knowledge needed to answer the Supreme Court free response question on the exam, and we'll even look at some past exam questions. Okay, let's start with Marbury versus Madison. Marbury versus Madison is a really complicated case, so I'll start with the reason it's important, then we'll fill in the gaps. Essentially, this case established the principle of judicial review, which means the Supreme Court can strike down unconstitutional laws passed by Congress. So, in this case, Congress had passed a law. The court then said that the law contradicted the Constitution, and so that law was struck down, meaning it would pretty much no longer exist. This case was the first time the court ever exercised its right to judicial review, where it strikes down laws, but it has been used many times since. By the way, you might already be realizing there's going to be a lot of information you need to retain for the exam. That's why I put together the 1-hour Supreme Court Cases Mastery Playbook. You can complete it while watching the video to get exam ready. Grab it through the link in the description and get started right away. Now's the time to fill in the significance point on the top line of this case's worksheet. I wrote, "Establish judicial review." This will help you quickly review the cases later during review sessions. So let's fill in the gaps to give you a little more understanding of this case. The law that Congress passed, which would later be deemed unconstitutional by the court, was a law that actually related to the powers of the court itself. But this is where it gets complicated. Essentially, before this law came into effect, the Supreme Court was following the constitutional law of original jurisdiction, meaning the Supreme Court was only allowed to hear certain cases first. All others must go before lower courts first. This included cases that involved ambassadors, cases that involved other public ministers and consuls, and cases where the states were a party, for example, if two states are suing one another. All other cases had to have already been heard by a lower court and were coming before the Supreme Court to appeal the lower court's ruling. Then, Congress passed a law, specifically Section 13 of the Judiciary Act of 1789, that increased the original jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. This law said that the Supreme Court could exercise original jurisdiction to issue writs of mandamus, which are orders telling government officials to do their jobs. This meant that people could come directly to the Supreme Court to have a writ of mandamus issued, and they didn't have to go to lower courts first. What we're about to see is that the Supreme Court said that a law adding items to their original jurisdiction was unconstitutional because the Constitution already clearly established what is and isn't original jurisdiction for the Supreme Court. But we're not there yet. First, you might be wondering who Marbury and Madison were. Essentially, the court was presented with a case where one man, Marbury, was issued an official appointment for a job by the outgoing president, John Adams. Adams had written, signed, and sealed the appointment on his last day in office. But the appointment letter was never delivered. The new president, Thomas Jefferson, then came into office and ordered his Secretary of State, James Madison, not to send the document to Marbury. So Marbury went straight to the Supreme Court and asked them to issue a writ of mandamus forcing James Madison to hand over the document, which Marbury needed in order to officially take the job. So, suddenly we were in a situation where the Supreme Court was being asked to exercise the power that Congress had granted the court in the Judiciary Act of 1789. So, next the Supreme Court ruled that even though Marbury should get the job, they couldn't do anything about it because they didn't have the original jurisdiction, in this case, to issue a writ of mandamus. Essentially, the court said that the law Congress passed that would have allowed them to issue the writ of mandamus was unconstitutional, because Congress couldn't increase the Supreme Court's original jurisdiction. Okay, so I understand this is a very complicated case, so let's pause and look at exactly what you need to know for this case. Remember, for the exam, you need to be able to explain the court's overall holding, which means what the court's final decision was on the case. Essentially, the court's holding was that a law passed by Congress was unconstitutional, meaning it contradicted the Constitution, and therefore it was to be struck down. This was the first instance of judicial review. That's the most important thing you need to know about this case. So next, you may need to be able to talk about the political principles at the heart of this law. There are two. First, this case established judicial review for the first time. Judicial review means the Supreme Court can say a law or government action is unconstitutional. This set the precedent for the Supreme Court to strike down many future laws that Congress passed, which the court found to go against the Constitution. Second, this case demonstrates the political principle of checks and balances. By striking down Congress's law, the court limited the power of Congress by saying Congress couldn't just create any law it wanted. All laws must be consistent with the Constitution. In other words, the court exercised its ability to check the power of Congress. Okay, let's look at a comparison to a related court case. In the exam, you'll be presented with the facts in one non-required Supreme Court case, and you'll be asked to compare it to one of the 14 required Supreme Court cases. Expect to be asked about a core principle or constitutional clause common in the two cases, and also how the holdings in the two cases are similar or different. Okay, so let's imagine you're asked to compare Marbury versus Madison to Loving versus Virginia. In the exam, you'd be given an overview of the non-required case. So, in Loving versus Virginia, you'd be told about a white man named Richard Loving and a black woman named Mildred Jeter, who got married in Washington, D.C., where interracial marriage was legal. When they returned home to Virginia, they were arrested because the state had a law that made marriages between people of different races illegal. The couple argued that this law violated their basic rights under the Constitution, especially the right to equal protection and the right to marry the person you choose. The Supreme Court agreed with Loving and ruled that Virginia's ban on interracial marriage was unconstitutional. This decision ended all state laws that banned interracial marriage. So, the first thing you'll be asked in the exam is to identify the common core principle between the two cases. Here, the common principle is judicial review because both cases involve the Supreme Court striking down laws. Next, you'll be asked to identify how the holdings in the cases are similar or different. For this question, you might state that Marbury versus Madison found part of the Judiciary Act to be unconstitutional. And Loving versus Virginia similarly found bans on interracial marriage to violate the Constitution. So the similar holding was that the courts found laws to be unconstitutional. Okay, that brings us to the end of this case. If you're following along with the 1-hour Supreme Court Mastery Playbook, complete the knowledge quiz for this case now, and have a go at the essay response task, where you'll get an inside look at an essay response that uses this Supreme Court case in an exam-style comparison question. Don't worry. You won't need to write the full response from scratch. You'll get to see a real completed response and fill in the blanks to help complete the free response answer. Our next required Supreme Court case is McCulloch versus Maryland. This case is significant because it set precedent for how two clauses would be used in future cases: the Necessary and Proper Clause and the Supremacy Clause. Let's quickly look at the Necessary and Proper Clause. Essentially, Congress was given a list of powers in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. The Necessary and Proper Clause states that the federal government can create laws so long as they are necessary and proper for carrying out those listed powers. When Congress exercises powers that are not listed in Article 1, but are considered necessary and proper for carrying out those listed powers, they're called implied powers. The Supremacy Clause states that national laws outrank state laws when the two conflict. Okay, so now you're caught up on these two clauses, let's look at the facts in the case. In this case, Congress had created a national bank, which was meant to help the country manage and store its money. One branch of the bank was located in the state of Maryland. Maryland was not happy that the bank existed inside its borders, so Maryland passed a law that forced the bank to pay the state a special tax. The national bank refused to pay, so the case was taken to the Supreme Court to be settled. This created two big questions that the court needed to answer. First, does Congress have the constitutional power to create a national bank? This was answered by the Necessary and Proper Clause. Second, can a state tax something created by the national government? This was answered by the Supremacy Clause. So let's look at the court's holdings, meaning the final decisions the justices made, and the constitutional clauses they used to reach those decisions. First, the court said that Congress is allowed to create a national bank. The Constitution does not directly say that Congress can create a bank, but the justices pointed to the Necessary and Proper Clause, which allows Congress to pass laws that help it carry out its listed powers. Since Congress already has powers related to handling money, like taxing, borrowing, and regulating the nation's finances, the national bank was considered necessary and proper. Second, the court said that Maryland was not allowed to tax the national bank. To explain this, the justices used the Supremacy Clause, which says that national laws outrank state laws when the two conflict. If Maryland could tax the national bank, it could weaken or destroy something created by the national government. So, the court ruled that a state cannot interfere with or control a national institution through taxation. Now let's look at the political principle behind this decision. This case is mainly about federalism, which is the principle that power will be split between the national government and the states. McCulloch versus Maryland expanded the power of the national government over state governments. In this case's holding about the use of the necessary and proper clause, this case strengthened the national government by showing that the Constitution gives Congress not only the powers explicitly written down in the Constitution, but also allows Congress implied powers, which are powers that Congress wields that help it carry out its duties. In this case's holding about the Supremacy Clause, the court also confirmed that when the national government and the states disagree, the national government is supreme. Both ideas shaped how the country understands the relationship between state and national power. Okay, so let's jump into how we can use this case if it comes up in the Supreme Court comparison question in the exam. To practice this, we'll look at how we could compare McCulloch versus Maryland to United States versus Comstock from 2010. In this case, Congress passed a law that allowed the government to hold people in prison who were assessed to be a danger to the public even after their prison sentence ended. Several prisoners argued that this law was unconstitutional because the Constitution did not clearly give the federal government the power to pass this kind of law. So, this case was brought to the Supreme Court, who had to determine whether Congress had the power to keep federal prisoners in custody after their sentences ended. The Supreme Court said yes. The court explained that Congress has several listed powers related to the federal criminal justice system, such as creating federal crimes and running federal prisons. Because Congress already has these responsibilities, the court said it was necessary and proper to take steps that are reasonably connected to those duties. As we discussed in the last lesson, you're likely to be asked to identify a concept that is central to both your required and non-required case, such as a constitutional clause that's at the core of both cases. Then you may be asked to identify how the holdings are similar or different. So, here's how that would look like in these cases. If you're asked to identify the constitutional clause that is similar between United States versus Comstock and McCulloch versus Maryland, you would need to state that both cases relate to the necessary and proper clause. Now let's look at how the holdings in this case are similar to the holdings in McCulloch versus Maryland. The holding in McCulloch versus Maryland was that Congress may create a national bank because the necessary and proper clause allows Congress to take actions reasonably connected to its listed financial powers. The holding in United States versus Comstock was that Congress may keep certain prisoners in federal custody because the necessary and proper clause allows Congress to take actions reasonably connected to its listed powers of managing federal crimes and prisons. So, the similar holding in these cases is that the necessary and proper clause was used to allow Congress to use implied powers. Okay, that brings us to the end of this case. If you're following along with the Supreme Court Mastery Playbook, complete the knowledge quiz for this case now. And for this lesson's free response practice question, we compare McCulloch to another case that was settled through the Supremacy Clause. So don't miss that, as it could be another angle from which you have to tackle the McCulloch case in the exam. Our next required Supreme Court case is Schenck versus United States. This case is significant because it limited the First Amendment right to free speech by saying the government can punish speech that presents a clear and present danger. This case occurred during World War I when Congress passed the Espionage Act. This law made it illegal to interfere with the military draft or encourage people to avoid military service. The new law was put to the test when Charles Schenck, a member of the Socialist Party, helped print and distribute pamphlets urging young men to resist the draft. The federal government arrested Schenck and charged him with violating the Espionage Act. When the case made it to the Supreme Court, Schenck argued that his conviction was unfair because the First Amendment protects freedom of speech. He claimed that distributing pamphlets was simply an expression of his opinion, and he believed the government had no right to silence him. Now let's look at the court's holdings. The court ruled against Schenck. The justices said that his speech was not protected by the First Amendment because it created a clear and present danger to the country during wartime. The court explained that distributing pamphlets encouraging people to resist the draft could harm the nation's ability to raise an army, which was essential for national security. The court introduced a famous example to explain this limit on speech. People are not allowed to falsely shout "fire" in a crowded theater, because doing so would create panic and put others at risk. Similarly, Schenck's speech posed a danger to the public and the government's ability to protect the nation. The central political principle in this case is the First Amendment protection of free speech. This holding showed that free speech is not absolute and can be limited when it threatens public safety, so the government can restrict speech in some circumstances. Now let's look at a comparison case. Cohen versus California from 1971, which was the case students needed to compare to Schenck versus United States in Set 2 of the 2024 AP exam. In this case, a man named Paul Cohen wore a jacket in a courthouse that displayed a message protesting the Vietnam War. The message used a swear word, and he was arrested for disturbing the peace. Cohen argued that his jacket was a form of political expression protected by the First Amendment. The Supreme Court agreed with Paul Cohen, finding that the offensive language did not threaten public safety or encourage illegal activities, so it was protected by the First Amendment. So, to prepare you for the exam, let's identify the overlapping concept between Schenck versus United States and Cohen versus California and how the holdings differ. First, both cases involve the First Amendment and the question of whether the government can limit speech that people find offensive or harmful. As for the holdings, the holding in Schenck versus United States was that the speech was not protected because it created a clear and present danger during wartime. The holding in Cohen versus California was that the speech was protected because, although it used offensive language, it did not threaten public safety or encourage illegal action. So, the holdings are different because Schenck's speech posed a danger and could be limited by the government, while Cohen's speech was simply an expression of opinion that did not create a security threat and therefore was protected by the First Amendment. Okay, that brings us to the end of this case. If you're following along with the Supreme Court Mastery Playbook, complete the knowledge quiz for this case now. And for this lesson's free response practice question in the Mastery Playbook, we look at a completed response to a question comparing Schenck to another case titled Brandenburg versus Ohio. The next required Supreme Court case is Brown versus Board of Education. This case is one of the most important in American history because it ended legal racial segregation in public schools. Racial segregation had previously been deemed acceptable in Plessy versus Ferguson, a 1896 Supreme Court case. That case said that segregation was constitutionally acceptable as long as facilities were separate but equal, meaning the quality of education at the black student's school needed to be as good as that of the white student's school. Brown versus Board of Education overturned the Plessy versus Ferguson decision. This case began when a group of black parents, including Oliver Brown, wanted their children to attend the nearby white public school in Topeka, Kansas. The school district refused to accept these students because of state segregation laws. Brown and several other families decided to challenge this in court. They argued that segregated schools violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, which says the government must treat people equally. So let's look at what the Supreme Court said about this case. The court ruled that racial segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. The justices focused on the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. The court stated that segregation harmed black children by making them feel inferior, and this violated the idea of equal protection under the law. This effectively overturned the separate but equal finding in Plessy versus Ferguson and forced states to change their laws and begin dismantling the segregated school system. The political principle at the heart of Brown versus Board of Education is equal protection, which comes from the 14th Amendment. This principle says that laws must treat people fairly and cannot create unfair advantages or disadvantages based on race. Brown versus Board of Education strengthened the idea that the Constitution protects individuals from discrimination by the government. Now let's practice comparing Brown versus Board of Education to a non-required case. Let's look at Plyler versus Doe, a case from 1982. This case involved a Texas law that denied public education funding for children who were undocumented immigrants and allowed school districts to refuse to enroll these students altogether. Several families challenged the law, arguing that it violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. The court agreed, arguing that the Texas law created two classes of children and denied educational access to one of them. The overlapping concept between Plyler versus Doe and Brown versus Board of Education is the Equal Protection Clause. The holdings in the two cases are similar. In Brown versus Board of Education, the court ruled that racial segregation in schools was unconstitutional because it denied equal educational opportunity. In Plyler versus Doe, the court ruled that Texas could not block undocumented children from attending public school because education is essential, and denying access to education to any children was discriminatory. So, both used the Equal Protection Clause to strike down laws that created unequal access to education. Okay, that brings us to the end of this case. If you're following along with the Supreme Court Mastery Playbook, complete the knowledge quiz for this case now, and have a go at the essay response task where you'll get an inside look at an essay response that uses this Supreme Court case in an exam-style comparison question. The next required Supreme Court case is Baker versus Carr. This case is significant because it allowed federal courts to hear challenges to unfair voting districts. Let's look at the facts in the case. In Tennessee, population sizes had changed dramatically over several decades. Cities had grown much larger, but the state never updated its voting districts to match these changes. This meant that some rural districts had one representative for very few people, while large city districts had one representative for many people. As a result, a rural vote had far more political power than a city vote. Charles Baker claimed that this situation denied him equal treatment under the law and therefore violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. But the lower courts refused to hear the case, saying that districting was a political question that courts were not allowed to decide. The case was then taken to the Supreme Court, who had to answer the question: does the court have the authority to hear cases about unfair voting districts, or must it stay out of these issues altogether? So, let's look at the court's holdings, meaning the final decisions the justices made, and the constitutional ideas behind them. First, the court ruled that federal courts can hear cases challenging voting districts. The court explained that when a citizen claims a violation of the Equal Protection Clause, that becomes a constitutional issue, not just a political one, so the courts must be allowed to review it. Second, the court did not decide whether Tennessee's districts were unfair. Instead, it sent the case back to the lower court and told it to fully consider whether the districts violated the Equal Protection Clause. Now let's look at the political principle behind this case. The central idea is equal protection, which means all people should be treated fairly under the law. Baker versus Carr strengthened this principle by saying that when voting districts give some people more political power than others, it may violate the Equal Protection Clause. This ruling helped support the democratic ideal of one person, one vote. Now let's look at one non-required case to see how you could compare this case to another case in the exam. We'll look at Rucho versus Common Cause, which went before the court in 2019. In this case, voters in North Carolina argued that the state's congressional map was drawn to give one political party a strong advantage over the other, which is a practice called gerrymandering. They said this extreme partisan gerrymander made some votes count less than others and violated the Constitution. But the Supreme Court said that, unlike cases about districts with unequal populations, there were no clear legal standards for deciding when partisanship becomes unconstitutional. Because of this, the court ruled that federal judges cannot hear partisan gerrymandering cases at all, and said the issue must be handled by states and Congress. Now let's identify the overlapping concept between Rucho versus Common Cause and Baker versus Carr. Both cases involved questions over whether the Equal Protection Clause could be heard in cases about districting. Now let's compare the holdings of the two cases. The holding in Baker versus Carr was that federal courts are allowed to hear challenges to voting districts because unequal districts may violate the Equal Protection Clause. The holding in Rucho versus Common Cause was that federal courts are not allowed to hear challenges to partisan gerrymandering of voting districts because the Constitution does not provide clear standards for judging when political influence becomes unconstitutional. So the holdings are different because Baker opened the door for judicial review of redistricting, while Rucho closed that door for redistricting claims based on political gerrymandering. Okay, that brings us to the end of this case. If you haven't got the Supreme Court Mastery Playbook yet, grab it from the link in the description and complete the knowledge quiz for this case now. Then, have a go at the essay response task, where you'll get an inside look at an essay response that uses this Supreme Court case in an exam-style comparison question. The next required Supreme Court case is Engel versus Vitale. This case is significant because it strengthened the separation of government and religion by ruling that public schools cannot lead students in a state-written prayer. Let's look at the facts in the case. In New York, public schools opened each day with a short prayer that had been written by the state. Students did not have to recite it, but teachers read it aloud at the start of the school day. A group of parents argued that even a voluntary prayer was still a government-sponsored religious activity. They believed this violated the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment, which prevents the government from supporting or promoting religion. So the key question for the Supreme Court was this: can a public school lead students in a government-written prayer, even if students are allowed to stay silent? Now let's look at the court's holdings, meaning the final decisions the justices made, and the constitutional ideas behind them. The court ruled that the school-sponsored prayer was unconstitutional. Even though students could choose not to say the prayer, the school was still using its power as a government institution to promote a religious practice. The court said this violated the Establishment Clause because the government is not allowed to take actions that encourage or support religion. The political principle at the core of Engel versus Vitale is separation of church and state. This means the government must not promote or endorse religious activities. The case reinforced the idea that public schools must remain neutral toward religion so that people of all beliefs are treated fairly. Okay, now let's look at how you could compare this case to another non-required case in the exam. Here we can use a real example from Set 2 of the 2023 AP exam. In this exam, students were asked to compare Engel versus Vitale to Zelman versus Simmons-Harris, which went before the court in 2002. They were then required to name the constitutional clause that was common in both cases, but explain how the holdings were different. So let's go through how you could have answered this exam question. In Zelman versus Simmons-Harris, the state of Ohio created a $2,500 voucher program to help families living in low-income districts pay for private school tuition. Parents could spend their $2,500 on any private school they wanted, so it could be a religious or non-religious private school. A group of taxpayers argued that government vouchers that could be spent at religious schools violated the Establishment Clause. But the court ruled that the voucher program did not violate the Establishment Clause because the government was not directing parents to spend the money on religious schools. Families made their own choices about where to use the vouchers. Now let's identify the common clause between Engel versus Vitale and Zelman versus Simmons-Harris. Both cases involve the question of whether government actions violated the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment by supporting religion. Now let's compare the holdings of the two cases. The holding in Engel versus Vitale was that the school's daily prayer violated the Establishment Clause because it was a government-directed religious activity that encouraged student participation. The holding in Zelman versus Simmons-Harris was that the voucher program did not violate the Establishment Clause because the government was not preferencing religious schools in the voucher program, and parents could make their own choices about where to spend the vouchers. So the holdings are different because Engel versus Vitale struck down a government action that promoted a religious practice, while Zelman versus Simmons-Harris allowed a government program to continue since the aid went to families, who then independently decided whether to choose a religious or non-religious school. Okay, that brings us to the end of this case. If you haven't got the Supreme Court Mastery Playbook yet, grab it from the link in the description and complete the knowledge quiz for this case now. Then have a go at the essay response task, where you'll get an inside look at an essay response that uses this Supreme Court case in an exam-style comparison question. Our next required Supreme Court case is Gideon versus Wainwright. To talk about the case, we need to understand a key idea called selective incorporation. When the Bill of Rights was first added to the Constitution, it limited only the national government. That meant that while the federal government could not violate rights in the first 10 amendments, state governments technically could. For example, the Sixth Amendment promised a right to a lawyer in criminal trials, but that promise was originally understood to apply only in federal courts, not in state courts. After the Civil War, the 14th Amendment was added. It says that states cannot take away a person's life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Over time, the Supreme Court began to say that some rights in the Bill of Rights are so important that they are part of the liberty protected by the 14th Amendment. So, the court uses the 14th Amendment to say that states must obey the parts of the Bill of Rights that guarantee liberty. This process of using the 14th Amendment to carry a right from the Bill of Rights down to the states is called incorporation. So, let's look at how this applies in Gideon versus Wainwright. Essentially, Gideon versus Wainwright was the first Supreme Court case where the right to a lawyer in a criminal case, which is part of the Sixth Amendment, was incorporated. In other words, from this case on, the states were forced to respect the Sixth Amendment and guarantee defendants the right to a lawyer. Let's look at the facts in the case. In Florida, a man named Clarence Gideon was arrested for breaking into a pool hall and stealing money. Gideon was very poor and could not afford to hire a lawyer. At his first court appearance, he asked the judge to appoint him a lawyer. The judge refused. Under Florida law at the time, the state only gave lawyers to poor defendants in death penalty cases. Because the judge refused, Gideon had to defend himself at trial. The jury found him guilty, and he was sent to prison. While in prison, Gideon studied the Constitution in the prison library. He believed that the court had violated his Sixth Amendment right to have the assistance of counsel for his defense. He wrote a handwritten letter to the Supreme Court asking them to review his case. So let's look at the court's holdings. For this, we'll bring back up the incorporation process. First, the court ruled that the right to a lawyer in criminal cases is a fundamental right under the Sixth Amendment. Second, the court said that because the right to counsel is fundamental, it must be applied to the states through the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. Third, the court overturned Gideon's conviction and ordered a new trial. This time, Gideon was given a court-appointed lawyer. With his lawyer's help, the jury found Gideon not guilty. This outcome showed in a very clear way how important a lawyer is for protecting a person's rights. Now let's look at the two political principles behind this case. First is the Sixth Amendment from the Bill of Rights. This amendment says that people must be offered a lawyer in a criminal trial. The second is the principle of incorporation, which uses the Due Process Clause in the 14th Amendment to make sure that state governments must respect fundamental rights found in the Bill of Rights. Now let's look at a comparison case to see how you could compare Gideon versus Wainwright to another case in the exam. We will use Betts versus Brady from 1942, which was the non-required case that students had to compare to Gideon versus Wainwright in the 2021 AP exam. Students had to identify the common constitutional amendment in the Bill of Rights between the two cases, and then were presented a question about the holdings. So, here's what happened in Betts versus Brady, which occurred 21 years before Gideon versus Wainwright. In this case, a man named Smith Betts was charged with robbery in Maryland. He could not afford a lawyer and asked the judge to appoint one. The judge refused, so Betts had to defend himself at trial. He was found guilty and sent to prison. When his case reached the Supreme Court, the justices were asked a question very similar to the one in Gideon's case. Does the Sixth Amendment right to counsel apply to state trials through the 14th Amendment so that states must provide lawyers to poor defendants? At this point in time, the Supreme Court ruled that the Sixth Amendment did not apply to the states, so it did not become an incorporated right. Now let's identify the common constitutional amendment in the Bill of Rights between Betts versus Brady and Gideon versus Wainwright. Both cases focused on the Sixth Amendment right to counsel and on the idea of whether it applies to the states. Now let's compare the holdings of the two cases. The holding in Betts versus Brady was that the Sixth Amendment right to counsel did not automatically apply to the states through the 14th Amendment. The holding in Gideon versus Wainwright was that the right to a lawyer in felony cases is a fundamental right that must be applied to the states through the 14th Amendment. So the holdings are different because Betts versus Brady limited the right to counsel and refused incorporation, while Gideon versus Wainwright expanded the right to counsel and used incorporation to make sure that state governments must protect this right. Okay, that brings us to the end of this case. If you haven't got the Supreme Court Mastery Playbook yet, grab it from the link in the description and complete the knowledge quiz for this case now. Then, have a go at the essay response task, where you'll get an inside look at an essay response that uses this Supreme Court case in an exam-style comparison question. The next required Supreme Court case is Tinker versus Des Moines Independent Community School District. This case is significant because it strengthened students' First Amendment rights by ruling that young people do not lose their freedom of speech when they enter the school building. Let's look at the facts in the case. In 1965, a group of students in Des Moines, Iowa, wanted to protest the Vietnam War. They decided to wear simple black armbands to school as a silent message asking for peace. When school officials heard about the plan, they worried the armbands might cause arguments or distractions. So the school created a new rule that banned students from wearing armbands. Students who continued to wear the armbands were suspended from school until they agreed to the school rules. Their families believed the school had violated the students' freedom of speech, so they challenged the punishment in court. This raised one big question for the Supreme Court. Do students have First Amendment rights inside public schools, and can schools punish students for peaceful political expression? So, let's look at the court's holdings. First, the court ruled that students do have First Amendment rights at school. The court explained that wearing an armband is a form of symbolic speech, which is protected by the First Amendment. Second, the court said schools may only limit student speech if they can prove the speech would cause a substantial disruption to school activities. Because the students' silent protest did not disrupt class or harm anyone, the school's punishment was unconstitutional. Now let's look at the political principle behind this case. The central idea is freedom of expression. The First Amendment protects people's right to share ideas, including through symbols like armbands. Tinker versus Des Moines strengthened this principle by saying schools must protect student expression unless it seriously disrupts learning. Now let's compare this case to Morse versus Frederick, which went before the court in 2007. In that case, a student named Joseph Frederick held up a large banner that read, "Bong Hits for Jesus," while standing across the street from his school during a public parade. The principal believed the banner encouraged illegal drug use, so she took it down and suspended Frederick for violating school rules. The court agreed with the principal and held that schools are allowed to restrict student expression that can reasonably be understood as promoting illegal drug use. The court's reasoning was that schools have a responsibility to protect students and discourage illegal drug activity, so this type of speech falls outside the protection given in Tinker. So let's look at the shared constitutional clause and the differences in the holdings between these two cases. The shared constitutional clause is, of course, the free speech clause in the First Amendment. The holding in Tinker versus Des Moines was that students have First Amendment rights at school, and their speech cannot be punished unless it causes a substantial disruption. The holding in Morse versus Frederick was that schools may restrict student speech that can reasonably be seen as promoting illegal drug use, even if the speech does not cause a disruption. So the holdings are different because Tinker expanded free speech protections for students, while Morse expanded the power of schools to limit speech. Okay, that brings us to the end of this case. If you haven't got the Supreme Court Mastery Playbook yet, grab it from the link in the description and complete the knowledge quiz for this case now. Then, have a go at the essay response task, where you'll get an inside look at an essay response that uses this Supreme Court case in an exam-style comparison question. Our next required Supreme Court case is New York Times Company versus United States. This case is significant because it strengthened the freedom of the press by limiting the government's power to stop newspapers from publishing important information. Let's look at the facts in the case. In the early 1970s, during the Vietnam War, a former government worker leaked a huge collection of secret government documents to the New York Times and the Washington Post. These documents later became known as the Pentagon Papers. They showed that the government had not been fully honest with the public about the war. When the New York Times began publishing parts of the Pentagon Papers, the federal government demanded that the newspaper stop immediately. The government claimed the information could harm national security. So let's look at the Supreme Court's holdings about this case. First, the court ruled that the newspapers had the First Amendment right to publish the documents. The court explained that the First Amendment protects the freedom of the press, and this protection is especially strong when the press is reporting on government actions. Because of this, the government must show an extremely serious and immediate danger before it can stop publication. And in this case, it failed to meet that high standard. Second, the justices invoked a concept called prior restraint. This is when the government stops publication before it happens. The court said prior restraint is almost always unconstitutional. The justices said that the core purpose of the First Amendment is to ensure the public can stay informed about the actions of those in power, and the government cannot interfere in this process. Now let's look at the political principle behind this case. The central idea is freedom of the press, which is enshrined in the First Amendment. This principle means that newspapers must be free to report on government actions so that citizens can make informed decisions. New York Times versus United States strengthened this principle by placing strict limits on the government's power to block the press from publishing information. Now let's look at one non-required case to see how you could compare this case to another case in the exam. We'll look at Neer versus Minnesota, which went before the court in 1931. In that case, the state of Minnesota tried to shut down a newspaper that had printed harsh criticisms of local officials. The state argued that the paper was scandalous and should be stopped from publishing future issues. The newspaper argued that this violated the freedom of the press under the First Amendment. At the end of the case, the court agreed with the newspaper, holding that Minnesota's law was unconstitutional and restricted free press. Now let's identify the overlapping constitutional clause and concept between Neer versus Minnesota and New York Times Company versus United States. Both cases deal with the idea of prior restraint, which refers to whether the government can stop a newspaper from reporting on information, and the First Amendment Free Press Clause. Now let's compare the holdings of the two cases. The holding in New York Times Company versus United States was that the government could not stop the New York Times from publishing the Pentagon Papers because the First Amendment strongly protects the press from prior restraint. The holding in Neer versus Minnesota was that the state could not shut down the newspaper because doing so was an unconstitutional form of prior restraint. So the holdings are similar because both cases rejected government attempts to block newspapers from publishing, strengthening the freedom of the press under the First Amendment. Okay, that brings us to the end of this case. If you haven't got the Supreme Court Mastery Playbook yet, grab it from the link in the description and complete the knowledge quiz for this case now. Then, have a go at the essay response task where you'll get an inside look at an essay response that uses this Supreme Court case in an exam-style comparison question. Our next required Supreme Court case is Wisconsin versus Yoder. This case is significant because it strengthened freedom of religion by ruling that the government cannot force students to attend public school when doing so would seriously violate their family's religious beliefs. Let's look at the facts in the case. In the state of Wisconsin, the law said that all children had to attend school until they turned 16. However, several Amish families believed that sending their children to high school went against their religious teachings. Their religion taught that children should stop formal schooling after the 8th grade so they could focus on simple living, farming, and community life. When the Amish families removed their children from school after the 8th grade, the state charged them with breaking the attendance law. This raised one major question for the Supreme Court. Does the government's interest in education outweigh a family's right to freely practice its religion? So let's look at the court's holdings. The court ruled that the state could not force Amish children to attend school past the 8th grade. The court explained that the Free Exercise Clause of the First Amendment, which establishes freedom of religion and separation of church and state, protects the right of individuals to follow their sincere religious beliefs without government interference. Importantly, the court did not say that all religious objections can override state laws. Instead, the court said that in this specific situation, the Amish demonstrated a deeply held, long-standing religious practice, and the state did not show a strong enough interest to override it. Now let's look at the political principle behind this case. The central idea in Wisconsin versus Yoder is the free exercise of religion. This comes from the Free Exercise Clause of the First Amendment. The ruling in this case strengthened that principle by saying that when a law strongly interferes with sincere religious practices, the government must show a very important reason for the law. Now let's look at one non-required comparison case to see how you could compare Wisconsin versus Yoder to another case in the exam. We will look at Cantwell versus Connecticut, which went before the court in 1940 and was the non-required case that students had to compare to Wisconsin versus Yoder in Set 1 of the 2023 AP exam. The exam asked students to identify the First Amendment clause common to both cases and then identify the similar holdings between the two cases. So here's what happened in Cantwell versus Connecticut. A Jehovah's Witness man named Newton Cantwell was arrested for going door to door to share his religious message without state permission. Connecticut had a law requiring a permit for religious solicitation. Cantwell argued that this law violated the Free Exercise Clause. The Supreme Court agreed, holding that the state could not require a permit because the law improperly restricted religious expression. Now let's identify the First Amendment clause common to both cases. Both cases involve the Free Exercise Clause and examine whether government actions placed unfair limits on a group's sincere religious practices. Now let's compare the holdings of the two cases. The holding in Wisconsin versus Yoder was that the state could not force Amish children to attend high school because doing so violated their free exercise rights. The holding in Cantwell versus Connecticut was that the state could not require a permit for religious solicitation because that requirement also violated the free exercise of religion. So the holdings are similar because in both cases the Supreme Court struck down a state law that restricted the free exercise of religion. Okay, that brings us to the end of this case. If you haven't got the Supreme Court Mastery Playbook yet, grab it from the link in the description and complete the knowledge quiz for this case now. Then, have a go at the essay response task where you'll get an inside look at an essay response that uses this Supreme Court case in an exam-style comparison question. Our next required Supreme Court case is Shaw versus Reno. This case is significant because it ruled that race could not be a consideration when drawing voting districts and strengthened the idea that the government cannot treat people differently based on race without a very strong reason. Let's look at the facts in the case. After the 1990 census, North Carolina needed to redraw its congressional districts. The United States Attorney General said the state should include a second majority black district because the state had a large black population. In response, North Carolina created a district that was extremely thin, twisting for hundreds of miles along highways. It connected small pockets of black voters who lived far apart. A group of white voters complained. They said the government should not sort people into districts mainly on the basis of their race. This raised one central question for the Supreme Court. Can a state create oddly shaped voting districts if the goal is to increase the political power of one racial group? So, let's look at the court's holdings. The court ruled that a district drawn mainly because of race, especially if it is unusually shaped, can be challenged under the Equal Protection Clause, which says all people should be treated equally under the law. The court explained that even if the goal is to help a minority group, the Constitution does not allow the government to separate people by race unless there is a very strong reason. The court said that North Carolina's district shape was so bizarre that it strongly suggested the state used race as the main factor. This holding changed the future of redistricting by making it clear that racial gerrymandering is something courts can and should review. You might remember in our earlier discussion of Rucho versus Common Cause, which occurred in 2019, that the court ruled that politically partisan gerrymandering could not come before the courts. But Shaw versus Reno established that race-based gerrymandering can be challenged in courts. Now let's look at the political principle behind this case. The central idea is equal protection, established by the Equal Protection Clause in the 14th Amendment. This means the government must treat people equally. Shaw versus Reno strengthened this principle by saying that even well-intentioned policies cannot use race as the main factor in drawing voting districts. Now let's compare this case to Bush versus Vera, which occurred in 1996, which was the non-required case that students had to compare to Shaw versus Reno in Set 2 of the 2025 AP exam. In this exam, students were required to identify the common constitutional clause between the two cases, and then they needed to explain the similarities in the holdings. So let's look at what happened in Bush versus Vera. This case was very similar to Shaw versus Reno. Essentially, a group of voters claimed that Texas drew congressional districts mainly based on race. The Supreme Court agreed and held that the districts were unconstitutional because race had been the primary factor in drawing them, and the state did not have a strong enough reason to justify that decision. Now let's identify the common constitutional clause between Bush versus Vera and Shaw versus Reno. So, both cases deal with the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, which is used as the basis for challenging race-based gerrymandering. Be aware that in the exam, students didn't get a clue about which clause was used in Bush versus Vera. They were expected to be able to identify that the Equal Protection Clause was the clause that was used because it's the clause that allows courts to hear cases about racial gerrymandering. And you would know that the Equal Protection Clause underpins racial gerrymandering challenges because you already have strong knowledge of the facts in Shaw versus Reno. Now let's compare the holdings of the two cases. The holding in Shaw versus Reno was that districts drawn mainly because of race can violate the Equal Protection Clause and must face strict scrutiny. The holding in Bush versus Vera was that Texas's use of race in creating districts was unconstitutional because race was the dominant factor and the state could not justify it. So the holdings are similar because both cases ruled that race cannot be the main reason for drawing voting districts unless the state has an extremely strong constitutional justification. Okay, that brings us to the end of this case. If you haven't got the Supreme Court Mastery Playbook yet, grab it from the link in the description and complete the knowledge quiz for this case now. Then, have a go at the essay response task where you'll get an inside look at an essay response that uses this Supreme Court case in an exam-style comparison question. The next required Supreme Court case is United States versus Lopez. This case is significant because it placed a major limit on Congress's power under the Commerce Clause. Before we look at the facts, we need to understand the Commerce Clause from Article 1 of the Constitution. Article 1 lists the topics Congress is allowed to make laws about, and anything not on that list is left to the states. This is an essential principle of federalism and prevents Congress from interfering in state powers. One power that Congress has under Article 1 is the power to regulate buying, selling, and trading goods between states. This part of the Constitution is called the Commerce Clause. For many decades, Congress had argued that if an activity had even a small effect on the national economy, it could be regulated under the Commerce Clause. The Supreme Court supported this broad interpretation, expanding the power of the federal government to pass a wide range of laws. Using this broad idea, Congress passed the Gun-Free School Zones Act, which banned guns near schools. They believed that gun violence in schools could harm education, and weaker education could hurt the national economy. Because of this, Congress argued that even though the law focused on schools and safety rather than business or trade, it could be justified under the Commerce Clause. Now let's look at the facts in the case. In 1992, a high school student named Alfonso Lopez was arrested and charged under the Gun-Free School Zones Act for bringing a gun into his school. Lopez argued that Congress did not have the power to pass this law in the first place because carrying a gun near a school was not an economic activity and had nothing to do with interstate commerce. This led to one big question for the Supreme Court. Did Congress have the constitutional power to pass the Gun-Free School Zones Act using the Commerce Clause? So, let's look at the court's holdings. The court ruled that the Gun-Free School Zones Act was unconstitutional because Congress did not have the power to pass it under the Commerce Clause or under any other federal power. The court explained that carrying a gun near a school was not an economic activity and had no clear connection to buying, selling, or moving goods across state lines. Because of this, Congress could not stretch the Commerce Clause to cover the law, and no other federal power supported it. This holding limited Congress's powers and strengthened the idea that issues not related to Congress's listed powers in Article 1 must remain under state control. Now let's look at the political principle behind this case. The central idea is federalism, which means power is shared between the national government and the states. United States versus Lopez strengthened this principle by reminding Congress that its powers are limited to those that are listed in the Constitution. All other powers are reserved for the states. Now let's compare this case to Wickard versus Filburn, which occurred in 1942. These two cases were the two that students needed to compare in Set 1 of the 2025 AP exam. Students were asked to identify the common constitutional clause and then identify how the holdings were different. Let's look at the facts of the comparison case. In the late 1930s and early 1940s, the federal government had imposed wheat quotas on farmers, meaning each farmer was only allowed to grow a certain amount of wheat each year. This was intended to stabilize the price of wheat in the marketplace. A farmer named Roscoe Filburn grew more wheat than federal limits allowed. He planned to use the excess wheat for his own farm, such as to feed his own livestock and consume it in his own household. The issue went to the Supreme Court. The court was asked whether the federal government could regulate farming for personal use under the Commerce Clause. The court ruled that Congress could still limit how much wheat he grew, even if it didn't enter the market. The court said that if too many farmers did the same thing, it could distort the national wheat market. Because of that, the court held that Congress could use the Commerce Clause to control even small, localized actions that may influence commerce. Now let's identify the common constitutional clause between Wickard versus Filburn and United States versus Lopez. Both cases deal with the Commerce Clause and ask whether Congress has the power to regulate certain activities that seem local or small. Now let's compare the holdings of the two cases. The holding in United States versus Lopez restricted Congress from using the Commerce Clause unless the issue was closely connected to interstate commerce. The holding in Wickard versus Filburn was more permissive of Congress's use of the Commerce Clause, allowing it to regulate a farmer's wheat production even for personal use. So, the holdings are different because United States versus Lopez limited Congress's power under the Commerce Clause while Wickard versus Filburn expanded it. Okay, that brings us to the end of this case. If you haven't got the Supreme Court Mastery Playbook yet, grab it from the link in the description and complete the knowledge quiz for this case now. Then, have a go at the essay response task where you'll get an inside look at an essay response that uses the Supreme Court case in an exam-style comparison question. Our next required Supreme Court case is McDonald versus Chicago. This case is significant because it extended the right to bear arms, which is in the Second Amendment, to the states. As we discussed in the Gideon versus Wainwright case, extending the Bill of Rights to the states is a process called selective incorporation. As a reminder, the Bill of Rights originally only applied to the federal government, not the states. Over time, the Supreme Court has used the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment, which says that states must protect liberty, to say that the states must also respect fundamental rights from the Bill of Rights. So, in this case, incorporation was used to extend the right to bear arms to the states. Let's look at the facts in the case. The city of Chicago had strict handgun rules that made it extremely difficult for residents to legally own a handgun, even for self-defense inside their own homes. Otis McDonald, a 76-year-old man who lived in a neighborhood with high crime, wanted a handgun to protect himself. He argued that Chicago's ban violated his Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms. But Chicago argued that the Second Amendment limited only the federal government from passing gun laws, not individual cities or states. This raised one major question for the Supreme Court. Does the Second Amendment apply to state and local governments or just the federal government? So let's look at the court's holdings. The court ruled that the Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms is a fundamental right that is deeply rooted in American history and tradition. Because of this, the court held that the 14th Amendment's Due Process Clause incorporates the Second Amendment as a fundamental liberty, meaning states and cities also had to respect it. This means that states and cities cannot pass laws that violate the core purpose of the Second Amendment, which is the right to keep a weapon. Now let's look at the political principle behind this case. The central idea is selective incorporation, which is the process of applying the Bill of Rights to the states using the 14th Amendment. The McDonald versus Chicago case confirmed that the Second Amendment is one of the rights that must be protected from state interference through incorporation. Now let's compare this case to Timbs versus Indiana from 2019, which was the comparison case that students were asked to use in Set 2 of the 2022 AP exam. In the exam, students were asked to identify the legal doctrine that is common in both cases, and then explain how the holdings in both cases were similar. So, here are the facts of the case. In Timbs versus Indiana, a man named Tyson Timbs was arrested for a drug offense, and the state seized his expensive Land Rover as punishment. He argued that this violated the excessive fines clause of the Eighth Amendment in the Bill of Rights, which stated that people couldn't be punished with fines that were unreasonably high. Indiana argued that the excessive fines clause doesn't apply to states. The Supreme Court agreed with Timbs and held that the excessive fines clause applies to the states because this is a fundamental liberty. Now let's identify the overlapping legal doctrine between Timbs versus Indiana and McDonald versus Chicago. Both cases rely on the doctrine of selective incorporation to apply parts of the Bill of Rights to state governments. Now let's compare the holdings of the two cases. The holding in McDonald versus Chicago was that the Second Amendment applies to the states because it is a fundamental right that is incorporated through the 14th Amendment. The holding in Timbs versus Indiana was that the Eighth Amendment's excessive fines clause also applies to the states through the 14th Amendment. So the holdings are similar because both cases involve the incorporation of individual rights from the Bill of Rights and required states to follow those protections. Okay, that brings us to the end of this case. If you haven't got the Supreme Court Mastery Playbook yet, grab it from the link in the description and complete the knowledge quiz for this case now. Then, have a go at the essay response task where you'll get an inside look at an essay response that uses this Supreme Court case in an exam-style comparison question. The final required Supreme Court case is Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission. This case is significant because it changed the rules of political spending in the United States. The court held that corporations, unions, and other groups have a First Amendment right to spend money on political messaging because spending money was a form of free speech. This ruling helped open the door to large-scale political spending by outside groups, which still influences elections today. Let's look at the facts in the case. In 2008, a political group called Citizens United created a film that was very critical of Hillary Clinton, a potential candidate for presidency. They wanted to release the movie and run television ads promoting it. However, a federal law passed by Congress said that corporations and unions could not spend money on political advertisements close to an election. Citizens United challenged this restriction. They argued that spending money to share political ideas is a form of free speech, and limiting their spending violated the First Amendment. The Federal Election Commission disagreed. It argued that these restrictions were necessary to prevent corruption and to keep wealthy groups from having too much political influence. The big question for the Supreme Court became, can the government limit political spending by corporations and unions without violating free speech rights? So, let's look at the court's holdings. The court ruled that the government cannot limit independent political spending by corporations and unions. The court explained that political speech is at the core of the First Amendment, and the identity of the speaker, whether a person, a corporation, or a union, does not change that protection. The court held that as long as the spending is independent and not coordinated with the candidate's campaign, the government cannot ban it. This holding led to the rise of super PACs, which can raise and spend unlimited money to influence elections as long as they do not directly coordinate with the candidate. Now let's look at the political principle behind this case. The central idea is freedom of speech, especially political speech, which is protected by the Free Speech Clause of the First Amendment. Now let's compare this case to McCutcheon versus Federal Election Commission from 2013. This was the comparison case that students were asked to use in Set 1 of the 2021 AP exam. In the exam, students were asked to identify the civil liberty that is common in both cases, and then explain how the holdings in both cases were similar. In McCutcheon versus Federal Election Commission, a man named Sean McCutcheon wanted to donate money to more political candidates than federal rules allowed. The law placed a limit on how many total contributions one person could make across all candidates and political committees. McCutcheon argued that these limits violated the First Amendment by restricting his ability to support the candidates he believed in. The Supreme Court agreed that this was a First Amendment matter. They struck down the total contribution limits, saying they were too broad and did not prevent corruption in a direct way. Now let's identify the overlapping civil liberty between McCutcheon versus Federal Election Commission and Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission. Both cases deal with freedom of speech, specifically the idea that political spending is considered protected political speech. Now let's compare the holdings of the two cases. The holding in Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission was that the government cannot limit independent political spending by corporations and unions because such spending is protected political speech under the First Amendment. The holding in McCutcheon versus Federal Election Commission was that the government cannot place broad limits on the total number of donations a person makes, because doing so restricts political speech without directly preventing corruption. So, the holdings are similar because both decisions expanded the First Amendment protections for political participation by limiting the government's ability to restrict political spending. Okay, that brings us to the end of the required Supreme Court cases. Don't forget to grab the 1-hour Supreme Court Mastery Playbook from the link in the description to get exam ready and practice applying the concepts in exam-like questions. And good luck in the exam.